This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 241, A Window into Windows. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, is your Windows machine all booted up this morning?
My Windows machine, I'll have to call the Smithsonian. I sent it to them. And I don't know what last I heard they were using it as a coaster in one of the conference rooms.
Oh, goody. Windows 95. I think there were about 38 of those discs that you could get. Well, we are not here to talk about those windows. We're here to talk about the kinds of windows you see in buildings. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Quick housekeeping. If you would like the show notes for this episode, they're available at ihose.co/trifles241, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com for this episode. You can comment there. You can look through any links that we've got. You can also support the show in any manner that you choose. And of course, we are on social media, so connect with us there. Follow us, share our content, and tag us. We are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places. Oh, window into windows. There's a wonderful term that we used to use when I was a resident assistant at Boston University. We used to have to keep an eye on the unruly students. One of the things that inevitably happened every year in college dorms was, of course, was, of course,
That's
muting.
That's easy for you to say.
We would mute each other. Was defenestration. Defenestration. Do you know what defenestration is, Bert?
Yeah. It's sort of a slang way of saying the fenestration. It's not that fenestration. It's defenestration.
Defenestration. You're close. Yeah.
Wait a minute. Wasn't Fenestration the guy who was the announcer to Groucho on You Bet Your Life? Oh no. Wait a minute. That was Fenneman.
Fenneman. Yeah.
Wait a minute. What about Defenneman?
All right, we better get right to this, lest we really get off on another tangent. Defenestration.
Get off on a tangent? What are you, right? Crazy?
Defenestration is when you throw something through the window or out the window. And when you're living in dormitories that are 18 stories high, you can imagine the impact it might have on passersby below, or at least in those residing in lower floors. And it really brought to mind one of the first scenes in Baker Street where defenestration is actually involved. Do you remember any case of defenestration in A Study in Scarlet?
It's one of the most dramatic, in the Study in Scarlet, sure, it's one of the most dramatic moments in the canon where the reader has been brought along and there's this seemingly innocuous event in the sitting room at Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes calls a cab man up to help him pick up a suitcase or a traveling material, the belongings, luggage, and suddenly handcuffs are snapped on him, and he's revealed to be the murderer, Jefferson Hope. And in the struggle, he's halfway through the window.
Yeah, Watson says, after Holmes says, "Gentlemen," he cried with flashing eyes, "let me introduce you to Jefferson Hope, the murderer of Enoch Drebber and Joseph Stangerson." And Watson says, "The whole thing occurred in a moment, so quickly that I had no time to realize it. I have a vivid recollection of that instant, of Holmes's triumphant expression and the ring of his voice, of the cabman's dazed, savage face as he glanced at the glittering handcuffs, which had appeared as if by magic upon his wrists. For a second or two, we might have been a group of statues. Then, with an inarticulate roar of fury, the prisoner wrenched himself free from Holmes's grasp and hurled himself through the window. Woodwork and glass gave way before him, but before he got quite through, though, Gregson, Lestrade, and Holmes sprang upon him like so many staghounds. We dragged him back into the room, and there commenced a terrific conflict. Well, that's interesting there. He didn't go through the window and land down on Baker Street. That would have been another mess to clean up. But they actually managed to claw him back after he crashed through the glass and the wood.
Well, it's a wonderful dramatic moment, and it's also the first in what will be a considerably increasing series of appearances of repairs that Mrs. Hudson needs to worry about.
Yeah. Indeed it does. And, this brings up an interesting observation because at that point, we really don't know much about the rooms at Baker Street other than that they were large and airy. And this airy, large environment was probably given in part by these large windows that were very nearly floor to ceiling. These are very large, oversized windows. If you've walked down Baker Street and you've observed the row houses there, the domiciles, you'll see these very long windows up on the first floor. And that would have been indicative of 221B. And yet, there is an instance all the way at the other end of the canon when we get to, the Mazarin Stone, where a window plays a very, very important role in how Holmes sets up his ability to catch the criminals in the act, so to speak.
Yes, that's one of the, you've touched on a couple of points here that are really a continuing mystery when it comes to the environment of Sherlock Holmes. One is the actual layout of the sitting room. There's been so many different diagrams done over the years. How many windows was there really a bow window? Because when you look at the actual street, I don't believe there's ever been an instance of anyone locating a potential site for 221B where there was actually a bow window. But we know, from Watson's description at least, that there is one. But the other point is that suddenly in Mazarin Stone, it appears that there's been a curtain drawn around that part of the sitting room. And so it's this whole question of the sitting room. How many windows? Was there a curtain? Where was Holmes' bedroom? Because in Mazarin Stone, in addition to the curtain around the window, you also have a door, apparently, that opens into this space, which is an amazing bit of carpentry if it was created relatively recently for Count Silvius's arrival.
I can just picture in my mind's eye the hammering and sawing going on upstairs in Baker Street and Mrs. Hudson fretting about downstairs. Mr. Holmes, what's going on up there? Never mind, Mrs. Hudson, just making a few repairs. You better be fixing that VR in the wall you put in with the revolver. Oh, remarkable. Well, what a perfect opportunity to take a little bit of a break here and hear from our sponsors, and we'll come back and we'll talk about more instances of important windows in the canon. Stay with us. Hey, here's a quick question. Did you get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual for 2020? Titled The Unique Hamlet, it was edited by Richard Sveum, and it concerned Vincent Starrett's classic pastiche. Many people are asking about this, and the reviews are spectacular. The only thing is, you can't get a copy. Why? Well, the only way you can get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual every year is if you have an annual subscription. It's now 2021. Isn't it time that you took out a subscription to the Baker Street Journal? Not only will you get the 4 issues that arrive in the spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but you'll get that 5th Christmas annual issue as well. It's the only way to get that particular issue with one single topic, edited by some of the best Sherlockians in the world. Don't miss your opportunity to get a copy of the 2021 Christmas Annual from the Baker Street Journal at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right. Well, there are 3 categories of window and window usage I want to cover as we go into the second half of the show here. I want to talk about passage through windows. I want to talk about some more breaking of windows, and also want to talk about some decorative windows. So with that in mind, Bert, why don't we step through the magic window rather than stepping through the magic door that Conan Doyle wrote about, and talk about passage through windows, unconventional passages. It reminds me of my first child who was born by C-section, and he leaves the house by the window every time he goes out. There were other people who made their way through windows in a few stories.
Well, yes, and not the least of whom is Sherlock Holmes himself, but one of the most prominent ones of these is in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, where at one point in the adventure, we find out later that what's happened here is that the villain has admitted Dr. Sterndale through the window at the vicarage where Mortimer happens to be staying. And that, as I say, is in The Devil's Foot. But also one of the most notable instances of someone traversing through a window is Sherlock Holmes himself with a glass cutter in his hand to cut the window at Charles Augustus Moverton's.
Oh, you're jumping ahead. This is the breaking of windows I was hoping to talk about. We'll get to that in just a minute. The other one I'm thinking of is Lord Salter in the Priory School. He made his escape from his dormitory as he as he was looking to meet up with his confederate. Obviously, he thought it was his mother. Turned out not to be. That's the way he made his way out of the dormitory at the Priory School. And, of course, the German master Heidegger witnessed it and took chase on his bike.
Yes. Well recalled.
Yeah.
And suddenly it just occurred to me, of course, this doesn't really fit into any of the categories, but it's interesting when you think about how often these articles of furniture or these architectural details appear in the canon, because in The Three Students, it was the ability to see the test paper on the desk because of the height of the so-called villain peering through the window from the street.
Yeah, no, that's obviously very key to the story there. Well, you mentioned the burgling of Milverton's house. Holmes and Watson managed to do this with some rubber-soled tennis shoes, some masks made out of black silk, and Holmes brought along, and I love this description because it's part of his whole burglar kit, a diamond-tipped glass cutter. Now, what would a diamond-tipped glass cutter help Holmes do?
Well, it enables him because the diamond, of course, is harder than glass and sharpened to a point. It would enable him to, make a circle or indeed any sort of a shape in a relatively thin pane of window glass. And then with a suction cup or some tape or some other adhesive or not, basically pop that out, reach in, and then open a latch.
That is exactly what happened there. When they arrived, they made their way past the folks outside. They saw the lights in the house. They said the place was locked, but Holmes removed a circle of glass and turned the key from the inside. It's that simple. And, I'm always reminded of that scene, very similar scene in Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, where they're trying to break into I think it's the opera singer Gambetti's apartment, and they get caught in the act as they break the glass, and they're wearing, of course, the evening attire, just like Holmes and Watson were. And Professor Moriarty is there in the form of Leo McKern. He says, "Who are you?" He says, "Oh, elite glass fitters." He says, "Do you always wear formal dress on the job?" "Yes, elite glass for any class." "Is that a fact?" "You betcha." And then the glass smashes again. That'll be my assistant. We'll tunnel on now. Anyway, trying to keep the profanity down here. So that was one instant of the glass breaking, but there was also an instance where a window was open at the beginning of one story. A bullet made its way through and killed the man on the inside, Ronald Adair.
Yes.
Holmes made his reappearance, but of course his reappearance and his capture of Colonel Moran was made possible because of a window, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, very well summarized. It's that bullet fired by an air gun by Colonel Sebastian Moran that leads to Moran's arrest, because that's the charge in which he's actually dragged away to pursue the murder of Ronald Adair. But it's also the wax figure that is observed by Moran, carefully manipulated by Mrs. Hudson to appear that Sherlock Holmes was still in the sitting room at the time. That's the great bait for the old shikari.
Indeed. And, there's probably a whole premise that's probably been written about, that in order for Colonel Moran to have gotten so true a shot right through the forehead of the wax dummy, he must have calculated where to shoot based on where he knew the light was in Baker Street, because unless it was coming from directly behind the dummy, the shadow would have been placed elsewhere across the blind on the window. In other words, if the light came at an angle, the shadow would be kind of off to the side. So he would have had to make a calculation in that regard as to where he should have shot. So
Oh, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but we know, of course, from the final problem that Moriarty himself had been to Baker Street. And so it's possible that the professor's notes about the position of the lamps and so on were conveyed to Moran. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and this is where it's helpful to have a criminal mastermind who's good at mathematics. You see. Well, let's move on to the final topic in Windows here. We're talking about decorative windows. There is a wonderful description of stained glass it was The Hound of the Baskervilles. It was directly after Watson and Sir Henry arrived at Baskerville Hall. And you get a sense, because Conan Doyle himself had stained glass in his house where he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's a very, very vivid image that he makes. He says, "The wheels died away down the drive while Sir Henry and I turned into the hall, and the door clanged heavily behind us. It was a fine apartment in which we found ourselves, large, lofty, heavily raftered with huge balks of age-blackened oak. In the great old-fashioned fireplace behind the high iron dogs, a log fire crackled and snapped. Sir Henry and I held out our hands to it, for we were numb from our long drive. Then we gazed around us at the high, thin window of old stained glass, the oak paneling, the stags' heads, the coats of arms upon the walls, all dim and somber in the subdued light of the central lamp." "Just as I imagined it," said Sir Henry. Well, of course.
Yeah, it's lovely. It is absolutely lovely. And it's one of those wonderful points. You know, there's also a passage in another book Conan Doyle wrote called Duet, where the two characters, eventually a husband and wife, are in Westminster Abbey. And there's this lovely passage about the great rose window. So clearly Conan Doyle was very sensitive to as any writer would be, to the environment, the colors created by stained glass, and would pay attention to them. And then, of course, in A Sign of Four is the other appearance of stained glass when they're back at Mrs. Cecil Forrester's, where Mary Morstan has originated from. And as we drove away, Watson says, I stole a glance back and I still seem to see that little group on the step. The two graceful, clinging figures had the half-open door, the hall light shining through stained glass, and so on. And
lovely.
Yeah, beautiful little touch.
It is. It is. And then the other form of decorative glass that we see is mullioned windows. These are kind of the crosshatch that you may have seen, usually done in lead of the time, kind of decorating windows and enforcing the single pane of glass a little more. There are, of course, some mullioned windows in Baskerville Hall, also in Merripit House, to add to the flavor there. But in addition, this is a juxtaposition to the color of the stained glass. When we get to Musgrave Hall, Hurlston, in the Musgrave Ritual, Holmes mentions the manor house of Hurlstons, perhaps the oldest inhabited building in the country. Something of his birthplace seemed to cling to the man, for I never looked at his pale, keen face or the poise of his head without associating him with the gray archways and mullioned windows and all of the venerable wreckage of a feudal keep. Wonderfully descriptive.
It's a lovely description. And I think that the beauty of it all outshines the fact that because of that extensive use of mullioned windows, as a species, the mullion has almost completely disappeared. But that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Indeed, I never think of his pale, lean face and the poise of his head without associating him with grey archways, mullioned windows, and all the venerable wreckage of a feudal keep.